Some years ago, I had to visit my home country, which happens to be Spain. Just be sure not to tell any Republicans. They got all riled up over that whole birth certificate thing. It still gives me a chuckle to this day. Imagine thinking I was born in Kenya. What an utterly absurd proposition. No one has ever been born in Kenya. We made the whole country up to sell more coffee beans. Look, irregardless, I went to Spain because my father, who happened to be a miller, milling about doing nothing. I'm just joshing with you. Everyone knows old Obama likes to throw out a few knee slappers now and then. My father, the miller, had actually been crushed to death by his very own mill. Apparently, some of the smashed up remains of his mutilated body got into the flour, which was used to make bread. There was a huge scandal about it in Spain because so many people accidentally cannibalized my father, gave people the shakes, the Cartagena shivers, we called them. He was a very hard worker, one of those fire types, meaning financially independent, retire early, and was working every day without holidays to save up to retire early. Sadly, he died before he was ever able to achieve that dream. There's a lesson in there for everyone to take away. Don't get crushed to death, but if you must, don't get crushed from the feet up like my father did. Apparently, his screams woke half the neighborhood. You'd think someone would have come to check on him, but instead, the last words my father heard before his chest was pulverized by that mill bringing merciful closure to his agonizing death were, shut up, you noisy bastard. Some of us are trying to sleep. Irregardless, after being crushed to death, myself and my two older brothers had his estate divided up betwixt us. I use that term advisedly. For a while, my older brother received the mill, and my younger brother received the vast wealth my father had accumulated in his drive to retire early. I was given a simple cat. Now, at this time, I wasn't yet president of that one country I always forget the name of, and had little to my name on account of the fact I'd invested all my money in hot pink fidget spinners, which I was convinced would be the hot new thing. Unfortunately, it turned out I was several years too early on that one. I have a similar story about Pokemon Go as it happens, but that's for another time. Look, the upshot of it was that I didn't have much money. So when the cat began talking to me and requested that I purchase him a new wardrobe, I wasn't sure I had the funds. This incident took place several years after the whole ordeal with my grandmother and the wolf, so I wasn't exactly surprised when the cat began talking. Though I did consider it unusual, the cat had literally never spoken before and was in the act of cleaning his genitals when he first decided to speak to me. My first instinct was to take the cat to the local IKEA, but it turned out what this cat wanted was clothes, as he felt uncomfortable being naked all the time. This again struck me as unusual, as he'd apparently been perfectly capable of conversing in English, Spanish, and Japanese. As an aside, the cat was a huge weeb, as it turned out, but that's not really relevant. So I'm not sure why I told you that. Look, just pretend I didn't, all right? Actually, I guess he does use a katana, so I guess that's kind of relevant. Also, every time he ran, he did that weird Naruto run thing where he had his hands held back on either side of him while he leant forward. Plus, every time he killed an opponent, he'd yell a Japanese word or phrase, but these were seemingly at random. Like at one point he yelled something which I later learned was Japanese for, "I'd like to have my labia dyed ice blue to match my golden locks." I mean, Uh, in what context would that ever come up? Irregardless, I hope you're using that word, by the way. I'm out here repping it. So it only seems fair you should use it. We got him a neat little hat with a nice feather in it, bought him a cape and some fancy boots. Then he asked for a belt and literally nothing else. This meant he was naked aside from these items, but apparently he considered himself dressed enough at this stage. It's weird, right? I mean, imagine if you had been naked your whole life, only to decide you needed boots, a cape, a belt, and a hat, and no other items of apparel. It's enough to make a man ponder his decisions in life. Irregardless, at this stage, the cat dashes off to the forest, shouting about how he has a plan to make me a prince and marry me to the local princess. But the first step was catching some grouse. This struck me as a little silly, but old Obama knows a thing or two about not questioning naked weebs who Naruto run into woods to ensnare birds so as to secure a marriage alliance with royalty. So I remained quiet. Now, after a few days, the cat had done this multiple times, but always came back empty-handed. When I raised this query to the feline, he stated that he was busy providing the king with the bird, saying they came from me, Count Obama, and talked me up as a bigwig lord who had his own castles and swathes of land with grouse to provide the king amply with his favorite food. At the time, this was not true. I wasn't Count Obama as much as I was counts his pennies Obama. But nevertheless, my cat assured me he had this all planned out and would arrange affairs such that I would end up marrying the Spanish princess, which suited me fine as she was rather beautiful. For the next step in his plan, my cat insisted I needed to bathe in a specific river next to the dirt road where the fancy types would oft pass by in their horse and carriages. I wasn't certain I understood the purpose of this, but Obama is nothing if not someone who mindlessly obeys the orders of naturist weeb cats. So I stripped naked and began bathing myself while my cat stood guard. Unfortunately, it was while I was in the midst of my bathing that I saw the king's magnificent horses drawing closer, carrying the king in his resplendent carriage. Given how I'd been described by my talking cat as Count to the King, I couldn't very well exit the water to greet him naked. However, neither could I dress myself in my standard peasant attire. I reasoned the only course of action was to remain hidden. I actually have a lot of skill remaining hidden. Believe it or not, I'm actually the hide and seek world champion of 2018. Though some would argue that was only the case because Darren Hayes, a previous world champion, died in a cupboard after being undiscovered for weeks while training for the world championships. To my unmitigated horror, however, my cat began flagging down the king's carriage, screaming that he needed help. Naturally, I tried to tell my cat to cease through complex gestures. However, my cat seemed to only perceive them as the weird hand gestures Naruto does, and eagerly responded in kind. To my horror, the king's carriage pulled up next to the lake. My cat began spinning a yarn about how I was bathing in the river when jackanapes and scoundrels stole my fine silken robes. The king, who recognized me as a great man for all the plump grouse I'd sent him for my quote-unquote vast lands, instantly sent a servant down with the finest spare clothes they had available, then invited me to join them in their carriage. You're likely wondering why they had spare robes in my exact size. and honestly, so am I. I wanted to ask, but I felt kind of awkward, so didn't. And honestly, it's been bothering me ever since. I dressed in the fine robes and joined the king and the Princess Michelle in their fine carriage, and the king began talking to me about matters of state, asking what my lands were like, and because I'm nothing if not a positive man, instantly began spinning yarns about my fine fields and beautiful castles, all while making eyes at the gorgeous Princess Michelle, who makes eyes back in return. It's at this stage the king suggests we adjourn to my castle so he can see the lands for himself and determine if I'm worthy of marrying his daughter, which seems like we're moving at a pretty fast clip for a world where peasants regularly work the fields and half the population still firmly believe windmills are in fact dragons. However, to my horror, my cat agrees and rides ahead of us to lead the way. I have no idea what he could possibly be up to, but I've learned the cats often land on their feet. Uh, you know, that isn't a metaphor or anything. I'm just like sharing a fun fact about kitties with you. Isn't that neat? Regardless, I later learned that my cat had raced ahead to the lands of the evil shape-shifting giant who owns a massive castle and vast swathes of lands with accompanying serfs, servants, and other such staff. As an aside, isn't it wild this never really came up before? I guess it was just something we Spaniards all collectively tried to avoid talking about. I would say ask your local Spaniard if they acknowledge the evil shape-shifting giant that used to lord over so many of us. But we Spaniards are a secretive sort, and we'll come up with elaborate fictions about our country to protect it, such as claiming it's part of Europe or that we existed before 1952. Irregardless, first my cat went to the outlying serfs, instructing them to claim, if asked, the lands belong to Obama on pain of death by shape-shifting giant. I later asked exactly how my cat was such a wordsmith, and he just said he'd learned everything he knew about speechcraft by memorizing the dictionary, then putting words in the order he felt would be most advantageous. So I guess do that maybe. Next, my cat confronted the giant himself, asking if someone so big as him could turn into something as small as a mouse to prove the might of his magic. The giant did so, and the cat ate him, securing the castle and lands in my name. There's a lesson here, and I think the lesson is don't get eaten by cats, but I ran this by my cat, and he said the lesson is to always turn into a mouse if you see a cat, and honestly, he's a pretty trustworthy cat. Naturally, the follow-on from this is that the king asked the serfs who the land belonged to, and they told him, Obama. Then we reached the castle, and my cat welcomed me home. In that time, he'd instructed all the servants to dress in traditional Japanese garb and insisted this was a personal preference I had. So now, everyone in Spain thinks I'm a weeb, which is probably like 90% of the reason I left. Also, he kept saying, Taki no hotaru no hikari game ni itai no de yamete kudasai, then giggling to himself. But I honestly have no idea what that means. Having seen evidence of my vast wealth, the king naturally let me marry his daughter, the lovely Michelle. For any gentleman struggling with the ladies out there, the answer is clearly to let your genius weeb cat set you up. You won't be disappointed. If you're gay, I guess maybe get your talking dog to set you up. Irregardless, a vast fortune and happy family life secured, we moved to America, and I decided to run for president to meme on Republicans. This required my contending with the powerful sorceress Hillary, But that's a story for another time. There's a final lesson here for all of us. And I think the lesson is, if you have a genius talking cat who requires a long weekend and an assortment of loose change to set you up for life as one of the richest people in the world, then maybe don't run a mill with minimal safety procedures if your whole thing is retiring as soon as possible.